Well, I got us a new camera angle here. If you want to see me better when I'm talking to you. And I'm playing this music because my discussion today is parody. And this is the music I used to parody Norah Jones. Don't know why. You'll be on my mind forever. Remember? Why the hell do you think I know how to cook? Is it my accent? Well, I used a deeper voice. Why the hell do you think I know how to cook? Sorry about that if that offended anyone. I don't know what got into me, but don't know why. It was another why question. I was just making why questions. And I removed that myself voluntarily because, I don't know, I guess it just didn't fit in with anything else that I had on the web at that time. It was all the other things I had were all original. So that song was kind of confusing, I think, for people. And so that was the only reason I did that. I don't think I would have had to do it. I was parodying it, I wasn't playing it. And that's an important point with parody, is that parody is something that's different from the work, from its source. It's something that's totally different from its source, and it's offering something different than its source. Like, when I write a parody, it's a work of comedy, I'm offering you a laugh based on that parody. If they plagiarize that, that's not parodying, that's plagiarizing. I've already done the job of parodying. I've already done that myself with my own parody, and then they've just simply stolen those words and said that they wrote them. And then they call that parodying me. No, that's plagiarizing me. They didn't go to the library all those hundreds of times and take all those DVDs out of the library that were the sources of my parodies that I list in my comedy index. They didn't view those and then when they were looking at them turn those into my parodies. I did that, and then all they did was come along behind afterwards, plagiarize it. Plagiarizing is not parody. Now, I've also been critical of people for being too imitative, and parody is an imitation. But I excuse myself because my goal with a parody is to exaggerate my target beyond all recognition, so that when you're watching you don't even know the source of this parody. There's no way, I doubt there's any way that you would be able to guess that turtleneck came from Banachek. By the time I'm finished parodying Banachek, you have a man on a 10-speed rather than in his chauffeur-driven car, and he's carrying a walkie-talkie rather than having his posh car phone and so forth. And all he has left is his turtleneck, which looks silly, you know, with everything else. That's what you call parody. But I would also say that it falls into burlesque too, my work, a lot of it, because my parodies exaggerate so extremely that they end up becoming like theater of the absurd, where a lot of the laughter is just in the absurdity of the dialogue. So in that case it's not so much parody as it is burlesque. But burlesque parody, it tends to be imitative, but an imitation that only I would know about if I didn't list my sources with the work when I publish the work. So if you do a parody right, then it's not necessary to know the source of the parody to enjoy the laugh. You have pointed out something funny about the source of the parody, and that would make people laugh whether they know who the person is or not. And I suppose in the case of political humor, you might need to know the source of the parody to be able to get the joke, just to be able to understand all the context involved with the joke. But with most of my parodies, it's really not important to know the source of it, because the humor that's used in the parody has a kind of universal appeal, I think, that doesn't really need any context to be any funnier. Right here in the A's we have parodies of historical figures, and once again, effective parody parodies something that is serious, not something that's already funny. That's not necessary. It's not necessary to parody something that's already funny, but some people might think it's necessary to plagiarize it. Like maybe what happened with a lot of these ahead of their times in this little series of mine here right on the first page of my 14-page comedy index. Ahead of their time, David Noy parodies Sigmund Freud, very serious fellow. And we have some French physicists, groundbreaking physicists, here being parodied. And we have Francisco Domino, Christopher Columbus being parodied, Charles Darwin being parodied, Rasputin being parodied, Mata Hari being parodied, all rather serious figures in history being parodied. And Canadian history is another rather dry topic for parody. But, and I'm not I'm not trying to put my country down at all with this series. I'm just simply enjoying a hobby of mine, which is to write parodies, and this is another example of something that you can parody that is serious, but that's why you can make something funny out of it, because it's serious. And the big joke, I think, in a lot of my Canadian history segments is just the slow-moving nature of the story, and the obscurity, of course, the obscurity of the references, because Canadian history is not exactly an international favorite. Although some people might be more attracted to it for that reason. And Canadian history, which I found dull myself, I didn't like being taught it. I enjoyed reading it for myself, but I wasn't crazy about sitting in a classroom and listening to long discussions about it. Against my will, I tended to get bored. And here where they're talking about the Riel Rebellion, where we actually have a scene where everyone falls asleep, because this is such a quiet story, especially when it's supposed to be about a rebellion. Just wanted to spare you the noise from next door, although I don't want to discourage anyone from using the facilities. With parodies then, you want some distance between the parody and the source of your parody. And the distance is provided usually by your own personality or your own opinion, how you feel about the source of your parody. And it seems to work well if the source of your parody irks you somehow. And when I'm watching a documentary about ancient Rome, I'm watching it to learn about ancient Rome, and I find quite often that what I get is, I get information about ancient Rome, but then I get this extra information that I'm not interested in, which are comparisons of ancient Roman figures to modern US celebrities or politicians or even generals or people like that. And I just think that it bothers me. I don't think it's necessary, and so that's why I ended up writing that parody, where I just think they go overboard with this comparing themselves to ancient Rome in their documentaries. They do it too much, I think. At least they did in those documentaries that I was looking at. So that's an example of me, something, my own feeling, and how something irked me and then I turned it into a parody. Seems to work well because that was popular enough to get stolen by a popular TV show. And another way to put some distance between yourself and the source of your parody is to put your own personal experience into the parody. That's the best way to be original, is to inject yourself into your work as much as you can. And in the case of Code Breakers of Stanley Park here, I am not just creating distance by parodying something, making a comedy out of something that's serious, World War II, but also by exaggerating the trials of these code breakers. And I was better equipped to do it, I think, than other comedy writers because of my own experience with computer code, which can be very cryptic, and where the logic, a lot of the logic is probably the same as that which is used by cryptanalysts when they're trying to crack these codes. And I was able to take that knowledge of mine and use it to make a convincing lecture here at the top of the script by whoever the mathematician is who's helping them, which even had a couple of real mathematical references in it here, such as hexadecimal triplet string, to make it sound more convincing, although it's totally ridiculous. Decapitalism is probably not a very popular one among business people. Sorry about that, I wasn't trying to be scary or anything, I think. I just needed to get a few things off my chest about how I was being treated mostly. And also, perhaps a few people would know if I didn't mention it, that this was inspired by a DVD I saw about the French Revolution, Decapitalism, which is why it features a guillotine. And even though it's a game show and everything, it didn't come from a game show. It came from a documentary about the French Revolution. I used the game show to separate my parody from its source. And let's see. Don't Destroy the Kitchen is a parody of my real life, where I've lived in several rooming houses now, and we tend to have trouble in the kitchen with sometimes when we get a bad tenant moving in. That's a parody of my own life, and since no one lives my life, that makes it totally original. Now we'll just move on a little further down here, and we see The Driver, a parody of a Twilight Zone episode, The Hitchhiker, the one about the young lady who doesn't want to pick up the hitchhiker because he's a creepy looking stranger, but she keeps seeing him all along the road, and it's a very scary episode. But I just focused on her reckless driving and just stayed with that through the whole parody, and I was able to write a pretty decent parody by just focusing on her bad driving. And then, when you get into someone who's got bad driving, the joke then is just their bad driving. It's not so much, this is a Twilight Zone episode, but just that they're a bad driver, so that this would end up being funny, even if no one saw the episode that it was based on. Found another one here, Le Miscreant, that I want to talk about. While it lists its source as Les Miserables, that was not what got me writing it. What got me writing it was being ripped off by people and then forgiving them afterwards, saying that they could have it, and hoping that that would be put a stop to it, but then they just came back for more and more after I forgave them. So that's what Le Miscreant is really about. It's really about my personal experience more than a parody of Les Miserables. What I did was take a scene from Les Miserables and inject my own personal life into it to make it an original parody in that one, Le Miscreant. A Lunar Dimension is, again, a parody of these kind of very serious shows like The Twilight Zone and so forth. I parodied almost the whole third season of The Twilight Zone in this account. One Thin Grocer, an example of verse parody where I'm parodying the song One Tin Soldier, but I'm putting a lot of distance between that song and this parody in these words, which totally stay focused on the experience of a cashier and how it makes him lose faith in humanity. Seeing people when they're in the store, in that mode, in that consuming mode, can be a little frightening. I once worked in a large department store. I love people, but they're a little scary when they get together to shop. And down here we have Palumbo, a series which I love. So it's also important to say that not all my parodies are, in fact, probably few of them would be made in anger or anything like that if I hadn't had this terrible experience. And in the case of Palumbo, which is parodying Columbo, obviously, I thoroughly enjoy that series. I enjoy it a lot, and I'm parodying it from love, really, more than from any desire to hurt the show or anything. And this is a longer parody here, but I get a lot of pleasure from that series, Columbo, and I didn't mean any harm by parodying it at all. If anything, I hope it helped that show when I parodied it. Now, in The Search for a Blue November, which was a parody of The Hunt for Red October, I was watching the movie and I got upset when the first officer refused to heed the command of his captain. He questioned the command of his captain while they were in the middle of a maneuver. And I see that a lot in comedy scripts. It's meant to add suspense, but it really bugs me. So I kind of lashed out in retaliation with this. And I didn't just get him to just dress down his first officer, but I got him to go over and backhand the guy right in the face. And it was actually my own frustration that was being expressed there, not the captain's. In Silent Night on the Western Front, once again a very serious movie, a beautiful movie too, a beautiful classic movie, All Quiet on the Western Front from 1930, long time ago, but brilliant movie. And here in my parody, there's quite a lot of distance between that very serious, heartbreaking film and this parody here. This parody is funny. And based on personal knowledge, something I learned about my father when he was overseas, that he may have collected medals from the bodies of vanquished foes. But anyway, I decided to use that directly in this dialogue, and shame on Mike Myers. Shame on him, and he's Canadian too. Shame on him. Now, in suspenseful moments in history, I think it's a good parody. It's not parodying anything, any specific show or anything, but it's just parodying how when they document history, they try to throw in suspense as they're telling you the story. And how are you supposed to feel suspense over something that has already come to pass? Really? And should they be doing that? I don't know, but they have you thinking that this argument, say, between Khrushchev and Kennedy is going to lead to global thermonuclear war, and of course we all know it didn't. That's just one example of how they will build suspense around something that's already happened as they're telling the story. And that's what gave me the idea for this sketch, suspenseful moments in history, which you could just go on and on forever. Just pick almost any historical event and just turn it into, try to present it as though you don't know the outcome yet. Now, with Thelma Addison's confusion, I'm parodying kind of the marijuana culture, the West Coast hippie culture a little bit, but again, I'm doing it from love. I love these people, and you know, I don't think I'm hurting them with this comedy at all. There's nothing cruel about it. It's all very done with love, I think. Well, I suppose that will suffice for a discussion about my parodies. Just one more I want to try to slip in here at the end here about my news reports, which tend to center on the inaccuracy that I perceive to exist in contemporary news reporting. And this, like I say in my poem, it is common these days to put truth on hold until a safe time for it to be told. I don't think that's a current phenomenon or anything. That's just the way it's been from the dawn of civilization. There are factors in the present that interfere with accuracy in news reporting. Probably the most significant would be people in power who do not want us to know the truth about certain things, depending on their designs or their position. For instance, if they want to start a war, then we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident to get Americans all upset that their ships are under attack and put them into a warlike posture to go over and fight in Vietnam. Now they're saying it might have been a complete fabrication. If they'd have said so at the time, nobody would have. Maybe the Vietnam War wouldn't have extended to the United States for 10 years. But the people in power wanted the country to go to war. We have here a story of a swarm of African killer bees heading here from South America that appeared on one of the news networks somewhere a long time ago, and if it were true, we'd all be dead now, I think. That's an example of how they just grab your attention with a sensational story that turns out to be completely fabricated. Now, the truth about the Kennedy assassinations, we have to wait until 2063. Why did they lock up the files on the Kennedy assassination until 2063? Well, if you're astute, you might have been researching this on the internet and come across a cold case files, a recent one, where an Australian forensic expert makes a very convincing case that gross incompetence on the part of the US Secret Service might have led to the fatal shot that killed the president on that fateful day in November 1963. Well, the Secret Service, the US government, will never admit any fault in Kennedy's death, so even after that information becomes available, as it has, they're still reluctant, they're stubborn to admit it now, and they probably will never admit it, and by the time no pressure will ever arise for them to admit it, at least until they're dead. In business, don't buy Enron. Well, they told us the opposite. They wanted us to buy Enron. They wanted us to buy that stock. They said it was a good investment. Avoid mortgage schemes that seem too good to be true. We were told the opposite in the first decade of this century until the bottom fell out of the real estate market. And lastly, I use my own blogs and songs as an example of inaccuracies in reporting, since they got the name wrong every single time they talk to you about one of my 200 songs or 200 poems or 3,000, 4,000 blogs on TV. These stars are wealthy and they're well connected and they're in a position to protect their image at the expense of their victim, and that's what they're doing, and that's why the truth of even my own life seems to be on hold. But I do have faith that truth will triumph, that we do honor truth here, that we ultimately honor it anyway, and it might be a bit of a struggle to champion truth and to still be alive when you're finished, but it's a noble struggle, and I'm going to see if it's possible myself by following through with my work, with my music anyway, and seeing if I can be as successful with it as all those stars who stole it.